I'm Jeremy Hutchison-Krupat. I'm the director of the Masters in Entrepreneurship. I will also be I'm also teaching the systems thinking course in the core next year. And this is, I'm excited because it's somewhat that's, it's a good combination of really everything that I am, right? So I'm an engineer who then ended up going into R&D and then did my PhD in operations management and innovation, and I've been in innovation and entrepreneurship for, a long time, right? And so really at the core of this is systems thinking, right? So today's webinar is one where I'm not going to dive into the program details per se in the main bulk of the webinar. But please, as we get towards the end or things pop up, and if you have questions on the program itself, I would be happy to take those, right? So while you have me here, please take advantage of that. So when I get to systems thinking, right, one of the first things is why is a systems thinking course even in an entrepreneurship program, right? And part of that is it gets tossed around a lot these days, right? But I'd like to say, why should you care? Well, the top line is fairly important, right? If we think about entrepreneurs are typically, tight on how much time they have, how much money they have, how many people they have access to, right? So if we think of that more generally, it's just, in general, very tight on resources, assets. Therefore, you want to make sure you make the right decisions with, right? And this is really what the systems thinking approach is going to help with, right? The next point is, a lot of the time we think things might be obvious, or we see we pull one lever and we see what it does, but we don't necessarily get all of the non-obvious, the second order relationships, how that sort of cascades throughout a system. And very often it means that we're solving the wrong problem, right? So operations and systems thinking is really about outlining trade-offs, right? So we want to reveal the non-obvious aspects of a problem, of an opportunity, to make sure that we can solve it appropriately, right? And to do this, we need to make sure we outline trade-offs, right? So at the core of it, systems is, can we outline trade-offs? And I have in here, there's always a trade-off. Yes, there's win-wins, of course, but whenever we're making decisions, there are always trade-offs. In other words, very often we think there's one way to do things, but there's always multiple approaches, right? And a lot of the time it's understanding not even just the trade-offs and the different approaches, but when we look at all of them, given we have a number of approaches, how do we actually decide when we use one? And is that the right approach to use all the time? Or what are the contingencies, right? So this is where I was getting to the first and second order effects, right? The direct and the indirect impacts of the things we do. Ultimately, at the end of the game, we want to make sure that we allocate resources and our attention, right? So the one thing that is really scarce when it comes to any entrepreneur, any startup, and just, for that matter, business in general, right, is our attention and our time, right? And sometimes we don't even give enough credit to how much what the opportunity cost of our attention is, right? So if we, kind of keep going down this list and say, okay, well, what could it apply to, right? Well, and I'll say, definitely a non-exhaustive list, but the systems thinking approach can really help when it comes to identifying opportunities, right? So identifying the true root cause of pain points. Right? So people will tell you, there's many, many stories that I'm sure many of you have heard of someone, we need this or we need that. People don't generally express what they actually need, right? We need to then analyze it and use a systems approach to figure out what is it people really want, right? What's the true root cause of a pain point? Can we understand the difference between an order winner and an order qualifier, right? So the order winner is something that's going to get someone to actually, you're going to get their attention, you're going to gain that customer. Whereas the qualifier is some threshold you need to be beyond, but that's not necessarily going to win you the order. Identifying these is going to give you a much better chance of having a good opportunity and a more successful venture. Right? So we can use it, just the figures I even have shown at the bottom here, right, are different ways of looking and finding opportunities, typical customer journeys, right? Understanding a customer journey is just a systems representation of a process, right? And then we're starting to understand what are the pain points, and we can enumerate all of these and identify them, right? But this really is using a systems approach to figure out systematically what do we need to solve, right? I should say in here, I will try and, I'll do my best to pay attention to the chat window down in the bottom here. And, if I'm breezing through or if there are questions come up or something like that, please pipe in and I'll try and address it as needed. So don't feel that you need to wait for me to ask a question to say anything, right? A lot of the time, we talk a lot about business models. Business models are ultimately how are we transforming inputs into outputs. That is a systems approach, right? So being able to analyze this, being able to understand who should we partner, should we partner with someone, should we acquire capabilities or should we keep them outside? There's a process shown, on the bottom left, and there's a process shown on the bottom right. These are two opportunities for us to run our business. When you look at them, you get a new representation to say, what does it take? What are the handoffs? How complex are things? What are we prepared to do? Once we draw these out and put all the relationships together, this is when we actually can make informed decisions, right? A lot of it is actually understanding the signal from the noise, right? So this is something that, you may have heard the term before, but especially when it comes time that we're scarce on attention, scarce on time, scarce on resources, we want to make sure that we're not just listening to the squeaky wheel, right? Is that squeaky wheel really something that we should give attention to or not, right? So having a systems approach to things is going to help us know whether or not, yes, I hear that complaint was bad, but actually it wasn't as bad as you think. That was one data point, and depending on the reference point, actually that had an assignable cause. We know what happened there, right? So again, the systems approach is really going to help us disentangle, is something outside the limits that we need to investigate it or not? There's variation in everything. We don't need to react the same to all different variation, right? And understanding how things fit together and analyzing them and using a number of tools, we can really gain a lot of insights there, right? Now, even if from a lot of the charts and a lot of things associated with systems, yes, there's a lot of analytical tools, and it can, if someone wanted to go down the path of lots of simulations or lots of analysis and lots of calculations, this is definitely can be part of it. But what really comes about and what really comes through in this course is actually how much intuition you can get from back of the napkin calculations, right? Back of the napkin intuition. Once you understand general principles about how things fit together, the clarity that comes from this and the guidance that can come from very simple understanding is actually huge, right? So you can get into very, very, key details, but you can also get a lot just from the intuition, right? I think one way to even see this is, I can talk a lot about how there's all of these things come about, but we can think of some daily activities, right? So I'd argue in many ways, systems thinking, a systems approach gives voice to the things that we take for granted, right? So, a few examples from just daily life, right? A choice that people make very often, right? At what point should you put fuel in the car, right? How low do you let the gauge get before you actually decide to refill with petrol or diesel, right? Equivalently, when do you choose to buy toilet paper? How much safety stock do you keep in the house? How much safety stock of fuel do you keep in the car, right? Are you very, very risk averse that, you know, when the tank gets down to half, you're going to fill it up? Or are you the person that goes all the way to E, right? A lot of these, this is just a service level, right? Noise could happen. There could be an accident. You could get stuck. You might end up running out, right? What are the chances? There's a lot of calculus that you're doing automatically, not really giving a lot of thought to, right? But we are going through this. Once you start, even, you know, the downside is once you get into a systems approach, you see things in a different way everywhere you go. To me, you know, I like that. Some people, it might be troubling. Every time you go to a restaurant, you can't help but notice the operation could be improved, right? Another one is, you know, if you think of it, how much food should you order from the caterer, or just more generally, if you're having people over, how much pizza should you get? How much pizza should be ordered for the party, right? And you start thinking about, well, what are the factors, right? If you know there's going to be between 20 and 40 people, and so on average there's going to be 30 people, and you know that on average each person has, you know, 2 to 4 slices, so on average 3 slices, so there's 30 people on average 3 slices, so should you just order enough for 90 slices? Probably not, right? So you make your decision on, well, what would happen if you didn't have enough pizza, right? So if you have a World Cup game on and you invite everyone over and you don't have enough food, how much of a pain would that be, right? And then you start looking, well, at the same time, at the end of the day, how bad is it to have an extra pizza or 2 sitting around, right? So you start looking at, well, the cost of having too much versus the cost of not having enough. And then you start to say, okay, you don't order the average. And there's a lot of principles that come down to weighing, well, what's the cost of having too much versus the cost of having too little, as opposed to a lot of the time just ordering the average, ordering what's expected, right? And this, you can think of this in pizza, but you could think of this in terms of if you're gonna place an order from far away, and it's gonna take, you have to place it a month out or 2 months out, and all of a sudden things could change and you might not need that, right? You can, right, so when it comes to just-in-time processes and lean, you definitely, this lives under the umbrella of systems thinking, right? So if you think even of lean startup is rooted in lean methodologies, in systems thinking, but there's a lot of tools, right, that enable just-in-time. So when is it worth doing something just in time? And what is even just in time, right? So is just in time saying, well, I always want to have 5 on hand and then I order these, or is it truly I order each thing and the part comes in that morning, right? What is the cost one way or the other? And this helps you decide that. It decides what do you know, if you're looking within sort of it can be a manufacturing environment, right? Of, do I order something from far away? Or do I try and keep things local, right? You know, famously, you know, Zara is famous for this, right? Of the fashion industry had gone, into an arms race of ordering things further and further away in an ever-increasing effort to reduce costs. Instead of saying, well, maybe it's not reducing costs, maybe it's getting better information, and if I can make things closer, I can turn them around faster, right? Yes, all costs. It's not at all. So this is a good point. You would definitely take into account all costs. It can just be the you know, if this is an event where you're trying to make friends, right? Because it can be status, it could be social costs, it could be all sorts of costs. These are when I refer to cost, this shouldn't be taken as just financial. It could be just your own effort, right? So it can be all sorts of costs. And this is a lot of the time when we're making these decisions, right, where it's not an actual financial cost. We're trying to weigh, you know, it can just be what's the burden of having to do one thing versus the burden of having to do other. How does it make you feel? How does it make other people feel, right? How does it make your customer feel, right? There's a lot that comes from that. Other ones along these, right, would be how frequently or when do you start the dishwasher, or how frequently do you do laundry? Right, so this would be a typical batch size problem, right? So you're looking at it saying, okay, I can do it very frequently, but there's a setup cost that I have to do with this. If I do it frequently, well, each time I do it, I have to wait an hour, I have to use laundry detergent, but I can get it more frequently. Right? So there's all sorts of problems that we make, decisions we make every day that are really systems problems. Every time when we take a trip, right? So Google Maps always shows the average, right? It would be very nice if they showed a distribution of the time it takes, right? Are you someone that is going to choose the time based on the lowest average, or are you going to look at the route and say, well, I can see the construction, or I know there's lots of lights, or I know there's lots of variance, and I actually would rather take the one that's a higher average time, but with slightly less variance, right? There's all of these factors are things that come into play and that we have tools to analyze when we talk about systems thinking, right? So we're going to put together a process. We're going to be able to understand things around what are the capacities, what are the variances, what are the relationships between these, and what are all the different levers I can pull to solve the problem, right? And they might not always be the same, right? So let me do a little thought experiment. See if this. I'm curious whether I can get any feedback on this, and it's one might be obvious to some of you, but I think it's not always an obvious problem. I don't think so anyway. So the thought experiment is this. You can imagine that you have identified, you have a venture, and you've identified you're ready to launch, and you have customers that call in, right? So customers who wait longer than 10 seconds before speaking to anyone at your business, they just don't return, or they're going to write bad reviews, right? So given this information, you put a goal in place that you want to make sure, call it 98% of the people who call in don't have to wait longer than 10 seconds. So the information you have is that on average, a call will last 6 minutes, right? So you get roughly 10 calls per hour. And then you recognize when you analyze the industry that low demand periods have roughly 15 calls an hour, and high demand periods have roughly 60 calls an hour, right? So you've talked to some people, and everyone said, you know what, you should you want to make sure that you don't staff this so they're 100% utilized. You want to make sure people have a little bit of slack in there. So you say, okay, I'll make it 75% utilization, right? So I'll have the low demand with 2 people, right? So the 2 people on here, they can handle roughly 20 calls, and there's 15 calls coming in, so that should be okay. And at the high demand, I'm going to put it there with 8 people, right? Because I've got the 60 calls coming in. That way I know I can handle 80. So we should be good, right? Are there any thoughts or comments? Do you think would this be a sound approach to do that? And believe me, I recognize that, especially in a webinar, right? So this isn't the class, so it's one of like, oh, I'm not. But most likely it might feel okay. It might feel good. Does it seem, is it okay? Is there anyone who's more comfortable with, okay, I'm comfortable with low demand, but I'm not really comfortable with high demand? Or, if we think about it, that it's, it could be that it's low demand for 8 hours a day and high demand for 2 hours a day, right? So it could affect the same number of people throughout the whole day, right? So if I'm really dealing with 120 people during each of those, right? So the increased number does not mean efficiency. And I'm not sure in terms of the increased number, that's referring. Right, so and this is where you're getting, right? So the high demand will mostly come in spikes. The low demand, so we can even assume that there's the same amount of uncertainty associated with low demand or high demand, right? So this is one of the key things, right? So this is getting at, where I left off sort of the prior example in terms of, do you want to choose a lower average time or a higher average time? Well, it depends on the amount of uncertainty, right? So you're getting at this here, that, well, it absolutely depends on the amount of uncertainty. But now we can say, well, imagine that there's the same amount of uncertainty, right? So there's the same variance associated with both of these. Okay, so it's definitely, and this is ultimately the challenge, right? Ultimately, the challenge is that we know, yes, calls last on average 6 minutes, but they might be 2, they might be 10, it might be 15 every once in a while, it might be 1 minute or 30 seconds, right? So it's going to have this sort of variance associated with it. And likewise, people aren't always coming in all the same time. So with 2 agents, we have less flexibility already when we're talking agents here, right? So someone here, we've looked at this a little bit, right? Right, so you could have, I won't even say we're going to change that there's more, so the sudden peaks could happen, right? So here we're going to say that it could be we can imagine the same exact variance, but it's our ability to handle the peaks, right? It's the ability to handle the peaks that really is the challenge, right? So we could even say, you know what, I went out and I did this, and I launched with 75% utilization, and I realized that more than a quarter of the customers complain about their wait time, right? So something's clearly going wrong. And the question on this is saying, okay, so I have options, right? I either across the board, I can say, well, I need to just increase everything so I have lower utilization across the board. I go from 2 to 3 and I go from 8 to 12, right? So that's a fairly large increase there. Or I could leave low demand alone and just fix high demand. Or I could leave the high demand and fix low demand. And so it's all questions of trying to say, I've got scarce resources. I want to solve the problem. How can I get some insight into what to do, right? And this is getting right at what, Minko's saying, right? What it turns out, the variance that you have on this, right? You're going to have variance, but the intuition when you think about this, when we only have 2 agents, 2 servers, 2 people gathering calls, what are the chances that both of them are busy at the same time, as compared to when I have 8 people, right? So if I have 8 people, the chances that all 8 of them are busy at the exact same time is less than when I have 2, right? So during the high demand, the intuition here is large systems have much greater capability and greater ability to absorb noise, right? So even absorb uncertainty. So I'm okay with having a higher utilization, which it's to many people who haven't looked at this stuff, that's somewhat counterintuitive. That when I have a lot of people coming, even if it's variable, that I'm actually okay having higher utilization than when it's low. But when it's low, I just don't have, as was pointed out, I don't have a lot of flexibility, right? In terms of you can go all the way down to there's just one person, right? If there's just one person, the chances that I'm busy when someone else shows up start to be fairly high, right? But it's examples like this, right? And there was an entrepreneur I'd worked with. They had just launched a vegan burger, right? And they did it with a small facility, and they were looking at it was a vegan burger made out of lentils, this was in regional in the US, right? And they realized that they needed more capacity, right? So they didn't want to hire more staff. They were guaranteed that what they needed to do was to get a little bit of a different type of oven or some automation in there, right? It was going to be for them, it was going to be a fairly decent capital expenditure. And when we went in and looked at the operation, you realize that when you map everything out, that wasn't even an option that was a bottleneck. They could have bought all the automation they wanted to, and they wouldn't have been able to increase their capacity at all. But if they just changed the batch size, right? So if they just changed how much they made at any one time and rearranged the work allocation, they could double their capacity, right? So here they were ready to have an outlay of, 15,000. Actually, on that one, I think it was And again, it might not sound like much to some, but if they were just, you know, for them, it was a huge amount. I think it was a 20,000 outlay, right? And really, they didn't have to do any of that. They could just rearrange the operation. There's so many times that we work with people and they actually, you know, there's something that people are telling them that, oh, you just need to buy this piece of equipment and it will solve all your problems. When in fact, they just need to understand, how are things arranged? And is that done properly? Is there some tweak I can make to the system to figure it out and to increase my capacity? Do I even know, right? So the questions we really want to get at here, do I even know what I can promise people? Do I know how much my capacity is, right? So ultimately, when we think about anything systems, it is anything that has a set of inputs, some transformation process, and a set of outputs. Right? But then it's unpacking all of these boxes to understand the relationships between them. Right? So we can answer questions along the line. Should we actually accept the contract that's being offered? What service level do we want to promise our customers? Should we buy the piece of equipment or not? Right? Should we partner with X, Y, or Z? Right? All of these are not obvious decisions that, unless we put things together in a systematic way, we're not going to be able to understand them. Right? And this can be everything from, you know, when we're looking at callers that callers need to be less than 10 seconds, that could be one level, but the same thing happens if you're talking about a server farm, right? So the same mechanisms are at play when we're talking about cloud computing that are at play when we're talking about warehouse consolidation, right? So once we start understanding the systems that are at play and underlying this, we can start getting at, okay, wait a second, ride sharing, Uber, cloud computing, all of these things are all taking advantage of risk pooling. Well, and again, when we risk pool something, we're putting it all together. So what's the downside of that? Well, it could also mean there might not be redundancy in certain areas. We start to be able to really outline what are the trade-offs associated with it, right? So at this point, this is one where what we end up doing in the systems course is diving into, you know, how do we lay out the relationships, right? How can we pictorially represent them? And then can we get at all of the core concepts that are going to reveal the non-obvious decisions and reveal the contingencies? Right? So can we understand, what is the staffing I need? Who is the partner I need to be with? How is force? Right, so these are, I didn't get what the fourth word there, how is the force, but when we're looking in systems, right, there's always going to be unknowns, right? So we know there's some risk, and a lot of the time we can try and get better and better data, and definitely data is going to, if you have better data, fantastic, but we have to make some assumptions, and sometimes we have to then figure out, can we design the system to be robust, and robust to what level, right? So we're going there, if there's unknown risk, we're going to try and gather whatever information we can, right? It could even, our business model and our business might be about getting better data and having a better risk model, right? There's, you know, ventures that we have in the program right now looking at this, right? So trying to use different models of risk to offer people that don't have credit loans, right? So it's always, given the information that you have, how can you calculate what you're able to do, right? But, you know, definitely more data is better. But one of the things I'd like to get across is there's just a lot of relationships that are fundamental, that if we understand those, yeah, so once we're getting into unknown unknowns, right? This is unknown unknowns is actually, so this is definitely a research interest of my own as well, right? I'd argue in many ways, though, a systems thinking approach, right? So my thesis on, in many cases, on unknown unknowns is we have to try. So it's yeah, the quality of data is one, but it's one, the interesting conversation that's coming from this, right, is that quality of data, the one problem there is that doesn't get at unknown unknowns, right? So you can get the data on what you believe, right? So the data you think you need, but there, in many cases, there are always unknown unknowns, right? So then you want to try and say, well, how can you can also diagnose when is there a high likelihood of unknown unknowns, right? So for those that we're not just having a small conversation here, the idea is always there's things that are, you know, there's the known unknowns, there's just variation, normal variation that's going to happen with anything. Then there are things that you don't know, but then there's stuff that just comes about, the unknown unknowns that there was no way of predicting, and here all of a sudden there's another dimension and things pivoted off in a completely different direction, right? So there's no way of, in prior weeks, being able to predict that. One way of doing this is to try and look at, if you can lay out the system, can you look at analogous systems, right? So are there ways to try and look at analogs to what you're doing and see what happened there, right? But by definition, an unknown unknown isn't something that you can perfectly predict. The one thing you can do is try and be more robust, right? So you can try to design a system that is more flexible. But all of these, even when doing that, it's so important to make sure that we enumerate the trade-offs, right? So if we're going to try and be robust to all sorts of unknown unknowns, this means, you know, we can't always be the master of everything, right? That it's pretty hard, right? It's one of these things where you know, if you try and accomplish everything, you're generally not going to do any one thing perfectly well, right? So there's again where we started was, one of the things we want to do is always make sure that we highlight the trade-offs, right? And this I couldn't emphasize more, right? So if there's in so many sessions where I'll try and it's easy to point at other people's trade-offs, but then when we're looking at our own venture, very often people always come back, well, no, but for us, we can do them both. We can do everything. So it's really hard because it tugs at us to be able to identify trade-offs of our own decisions, right? But it's one where putting proverbial pen to paper and outlining it helps do this, right? So that definitely very good question in terms of the data side of things. Are there other questions, even from a system standpoint? Obviously, this is only meant to be, we just a half an hour primer on things, so we can't delve deep into systems. But I also want to make sure that if there's questions programmatically, if there's questions on how things fit together, I'd be more than open and more than happy to address those as well. So I'll keep my eye here on the chat in the corner if anything comes up.